Hello and welcome to this review of I'm not sure actually. I found a few accounts of people with multi-term badged versions of this keyboard, but mine doesn't have the badge, it's just an empty recess, so it was either never branded or it just fell off. The multi-term keyboard was part of an extremely obscure luggable called the Multi-Term Portable Office from the 1980s. It's very similar in setup to the IBM 5155 I reviewed ages ago, with a built-in monitor, built-in floppy drives, and a detachable XT layout keyboard, just like this. There were quite a few designs at the time that looked like this though. The big thing that links my keyboard to these multi-term ones is a Micronorth marking on the PCB, the only marking on the damn thing. Micronorth is an old Taiwanese manufacturer of which almost nothing is known. They only ever filed 3 FCC IDs, all for what appears to be keyboards. If I had to guess based off of these IDs, I'd guess this is the KB-5060 because the 5161 is a known 101 key model. So, tentatively, the Micronorth KB-5060. You can tell the keyboard belonged to a luggable because of the very short cable. It didn't need to be long because it just plugged into the front of the computer, and it has these retaining clips here which kept it fixed to the front of the computer when not in use. More luxuriously engineered models like IBM's also had pivots by which you could fold it down while still having it attached, but more basic models like this had to do with these cheap plastic push-out clips. I originally thought it might be an actual Cherry-produced model because it seems to use genuine Cherry-produced keycaps as well as switches, but then I remembered that the build quality is better than that of wet cardboard, so it couldn't have been made by Cherry. It's got a mounting plate even, and steel no less, so definitely not Cherry. Anyway, I didn't want to talk about the keyboard itself too much because it's fairly generic, to be honest. I bought this keyboard really because I wanted to do a proper redux of vintage Cherry MX Black switches. The original video was a very early one from almost 5 years ago, and I didn't know as much about them at the time. Plus, I want to give them a run for their money against some of its competitors, because MX Blacks are said by some to be the be-all and end-all of linear switches, so they should make a good test. Particularly interesting should be the comparison to some of the modern Hall effect and optoelectric boards, like those from SteelSeries, Corsair, and Razer, which I'll show later in the video. Vintage Cherry MX Black are, in short, early batches of MX Black. These are pretty much universally recognized to be superior to later iterations, but the exact details surrounding this are somewhat shrouded in mystery. The original claims had to do with a change in the material used to make the switches, and that the switches from before this change could be recognized due to differences in the markings on the switch housing, specifically the logo. Now, later on it was recognized that wearing of the molds used to make these switches was probably a significant factor, if not the dominant one. Later production batches feature molded parts that are much rougher, which will produce a concomitantly rougher key feel. And in my experience, I've had around 24 or so MX Black keyboards of a variety of ages, they get better more or less linearly with age as well, not a black and white best before date situation. So this suggests, to me at least, that it's really just the molds wearing out over time. This is why Cherry in 2017 renewed their molds, which produced switches of better quality and smoother operation than those produced in late batches of the older tooling, and they did this for all switch types except clears, presumably because those didn't sell well enough to be worth retooling for. Now, it's considered doubtful by many whether these retooled MX Blacks can compete with vintage ones, but that's not actually the scope of this video. If I decide to do that, that would be a video of its own. There was originally also a myth that older switches are better because they are broken in, but I'm almost 100% sure that that's nonsense. From what I've seen and felt, there is no good positive correlation between use and quality of key feel. If anything, it gets worse. In one instance, I saw the slider cams having been grated practically to a pulp by the contacts, which felt awful. It looked like it had been attacked by a cheese grater or something. Conversely, I've had several models which were new old stock or near it, and those felt better, or batches of keyboards from the same source, and less used ones generally felt as good, if not outright better than the more heavily used examples. So I would say forget the breaking in bullshit. Personally, I don't think it's that. Now, in my original review, I didn't know enough about MX Blacks to take any of this into account, so it's time to correct that. To that end, I got an XT-era first-gen MX Black keyboard from the 80s, and it's in such an immaculate condition that I suspect that it's unused. But even if not, Luggables keyboards tend to keep much better than open keyboards because they're more protected when fixed to the computer's front. So by any definition, these switches are well into vintage territory. In fact, it doesn't get much older than this. MX Black will have been kind of a newcomer when this came out, and they're so clean that things like use, dirt and dust are really not a consideration. Ergo, this is about as good as it's going to get, I reckon. It's definitely the smoothest feeling MX Black keyboard I have. For a first, easy comparison, I have a Windows Vista era G80 11900 touchboard, so definitely not a vintage MX Black model, and this one is pretty much immaculate as well, so it's a perfect model to compare with. It feels very scratchy and unsatisfying, so very typical for a late MX Black keyboard. It's so scratchy that it's very audible even, you can hear the friction in the mechanism. It's the kind of keyboard that puts people off linear switches, as I'm sure many MX Black keyboards have. It's also too stiff for my liking, but of course weighting is a very subjective thing indeed, so I'm not going to condone it for that. There's plenty of people who will find this too light instead. It sounds like shit too. It's got that really distinctive powdery sound to it that these late cherry boards generally have. Sounds like dry queefs. Compared to that, the Micronorth feels smoother, a lot smoother. So there's definitely a difference between the key feel that crept in over time. That seems to be legit. Not really a revelation or anything, I know, but still had to be established that that was actually the case. Unfortunately, these feel even stiffer than the later MX Black, so much so that using these for extended periods of time is really not comfortable in my opinion. So even though it's smoother, I don't really enjoy these more than the later ones. Quite a few of them also chatter occasionally, so they put out 2 characters instead of 1, despite the immaculate condition that the board is in. Also, the F4 key is permanently on for some reason. But then again, this keyboard is around 35 years old, and you know when you pass 30, your hair starts to fall out and you get hangovers and shit, so, you know, I can sympathize with that. So we've established that these are better than later MX Black switches, but much more interesting in my opinion is the question, how do these prodigal, primordial, praise to high heaven vintage MX Black switches compare to the alternative options? And no, I'm not going to smear them with your stupid goo, stop asking. Lube is arse butter, think about it. Plus, I haven't lubed any of the alternatives I'll be showing you in this video either, so it's only fair. Let's start off with a contemporary rival, Alps SKCM Green, which is only about a year older roughly. This is a Zenith Z150 AT and it's new old stock, so it's a very equal ground comparison. Green Alps have a pretty solid reputation, so this should be an interesting matchup. Now, it's somewhat difficult to compare the two because Green Alps are much more lightly weighted and they also have a minute tactile event, so they feel very different. I'd say the Alps feel slightly smoother maybe, but that may just be the lighter weighting. The Alps also bind less on off-center key presses, believe it or not, but I know that that doesn't last as Alps switches are notoriously sensitive to outside contaminants, while MX switches are far more robust in that regard. If this hadn't been a new old stock board, that result would probably have been reversed. In either case, there's not a big difference between the two in terms of smoothness. I'd put them on pretty equal ground. Another thing from the same time, patented in the same year even, is Fujitsu leaf spring, specifically the 3rd generation, which is arguably the best one. These are very smooth switches with vertically mounted contacts, which allows for inline actuation, and this in turn increases smoothness. I don't have any new old stock ones, but this MBC885 keyboard is pretty good, probably the best one I have. I'd say the Fujitsus win out on this one, not by a huge margin, but I do think these are better. The difference is much more noticeable with their older magnetic reed switches though. I mean, even this old beat up motherfucker blows them pretty much out of the water. But then again, this is a contactless switch design, so that shouldn't be too much of a surprise really. Fujitsu magnetic reed are some of the smoothest switches I know, and very light too, much lighter than MX Blacks. That's something I never understood about MX Black, by the way. In my opinion, smooth linears beg for a light weighting. But anyway, I digress. Let's dive even deeper into the annals of history, microswitch Hall effect. Got a new old stock board with SW Hall effects here from as early as 1973, so it's a good deal older than the MX Blacks even. Now the weighting on these is much more similar to MX Blacks than the other ones I've shown so far, by the way. These are definitely smoother as well, but they do bind more because they use a secondary plate here, which causes noticeable friction with the keycaps when pressed off center. But that's something specific to this keyboard, not the switches, so I'm not going to count that against them. Most interestingly though has to be the question, how do these vintage MX Blacks stack up against modern contactless switches? Now these have kind of taken the linear switches market by storm, and they're in my opinion some of the best developments on the market of the last few years. My three favorites, smoothness-wise, are SteelSeries OmniPoint Hall effect, Corsair's OPX optoelectric switches, and Razer's version of Lightstrike Libra, which are also optoelectric. Wooting's optoelectric switches are also nice, but they're not as smooth as these. These three are collectively the smoothest switches I know, and they're so low friction that it's kind of hard to determine which is the smoothest, really. In any case, they're all top tier. Now, although these vintage MX Blacks definitely put up a much better fight than their later cousins, they really can't stand up to these contactless designs. These boards are so smooth that they make any amount of friction on anything you compare them to stick out like a sore thumb. And, well, the same thing applies here. It's just, you know, there's no way this is going to hold up. There is simply no way switches like this can compete with switches like that. The physics just aren't there. So overall, even though they didn't do too well in these comparisons, I'd say they're not bad switches. They are quite smooth, to be fair, and linear is probably what Cherry is least terrible at. I didn't put them up against easy competition. I could have shown some punching bags that they could have taken to the cleaners, but those are not what you would seek out if you were specifically after smooth linears. Like this rusty, vomit-inducing diarrhea arse fountain, for example. I'd rather stick my dick in a hot waffle iron than use this for a week. Thank fuck it's completely toast. The problem is really that they're just kind of irrelevant now. I mean, unless you're doing some kind of custom build that you're limited to contact-based switches for, but if you're mainly looking for smoothness or quality of key feel, these are way behind contactless switches, and they're expensive to boot because of their mythical reputation. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.